Thank you very much. I started working on Fossil Creek almost 20 years ago when I first moved to Flagstaff to be a professor in biology at NAU. I had done my doctorate at UC Berkeley, and I worked in basic science, because at the time there was a big gap between basic and applied science. But I got to indulge myself in understanding how rivers function, and I loved it. But I wanted to do something more applicable to management and policy. So I went in the exact opposite direction, and I did a postdoc with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the organization that publishes Science magazine. They put recent PhDs in policy and management positions, and so I lived in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City for 4 years working on international conservation programs and policy programs like the Biodiversity Convention. So I spent a lot of time dressed up in meetings and missed the field and missed the science. And so when I came back to academia, to begin a position here, I wanted to find a project that bridged interesting science with policy and management. And I went out to lunch with a friend who worked at the Nature Conservancy who said, you should look at Fossil Creek. It's a site where APS is considering removing a large hydropower dam and their whole hydropower operation. And that piqued my interest. Because dam removals are all the rage. There's been over 200 dam removals in the last 20 years. And they're coming down for many reasons. The first reason, or one reason, is for safety. The infrastructure's getting old, and it's more expensive to fix it than to remove it. Also, some dams are obsolete with land use changes. For example, an irrigation pond in land that's switched from agriculture to suburbs is no longer needed. But dams are also coming down with the sole purpose of restoring rivers. And Fossil Creek is an example of one of these dam removals. So why do we need to restore rivers? We need to restore rivers because sites like this in Upper Oak Creek are few and far between. Humans need water for many reasons. We need it for agriculture, we need it for drinking and bathing and for industry. But every time we take water from a natural ecosystem, we're harming the plants and animals that live there. Also, when we return the water, more often than not, it's in a lower condition and filled with pollutants. Non-native species or invasive species, I'll use those words interchangeably, are also a problem in freshwater ecosystems, and particularly in Arizona. And non-native or invasive species are species that don't live here but have been introduced. And in this case, it's sports fish, bass and sunfish. But the problem is they don't have natural predators or parasites, and they often displace our native fish. So what does a healthy river look like? What are we aiming for? And this is one of Victor's drawings of a generalized healthy river. And there's a couple attributes I want to draw your attention to. The first is that a healthy river has what we call a natural flow regime. And so that means that not only is it getting groundwater all year long, but it has variation in precipitation. So lots of small rain events or floods, some medium-sized ones, and some very large ones that cleanse the river. This variability in flow is also what gives rivers its structure. So a healthy river is a meandering river, and it has a diversity of habitats. So you have steep waterfalls, runs, deep pools, backwaters, and diversity breeds diversity. So the more diverse habitat you have, the more insects and snails and tadpoles and fish that can live there. A healthy river also has a riparian zone, which means that there's plants living along the bank of the river. And they're important because they keep the temperatures cool in the summer, and because in the fall, when they drop their leaves, the leaves are a very important food source for the other animals that live in the river. And in fact, there's a whole guild of shredding insects that have mouth parts that are adapted to shred leaf litter. A healthy river also has clean water and native species. If you turn over a lot of rocks in a healthy river, you're going to find a whole suite of aquatic insects. Everything from our big predator up at the top, our dragonfly larva that has a mouth part that's designed to scoop up prey, to the caddisfly below it that makes a house with little tiny rocks so that dragonfly can't eat it, to mayflies and stoneflies and midges. And in fact, Fossil Creek now has over 200 species of insects living in it. This is a picture of a not so healthy river, and I'm not going to keep it up for very long because it makes me sad. But a not so healthy river doesn't have any structure to it. There's no riparian zone. I think you all know what that cow's about to do. And if you were brave enough to turn over rocks in a river like this, you would find very few insect species. So why Fossil Creek? Why was Fossil Creek an important site for conservation and restoration, and why is it interesting to a scientist? The reason it was targeted for restoration is because above the hydropower dam, which was there for 100 years, we still had an intact population of native fish and invertebrates, which is a big deal in Arizona. From a scientific perspective, I'll explain the restoration, but two of the major threats that are threats to rivers worldwide were reversed. So I could study the first reversal of threats, that when the dam came down, the water that had been diverted for hydropower was put back into the river. And so for 100 years, 90% of Fossil Creek was shunted away from the river, and only 10% of the water was there. So it was a reversal in water extraction. Secondly, once APS agreed to surrender their hydropower license and restore the river, many biologists lobbied for them to do the largest non-native or invasive fish removal in the Southwest. So scientifically, it's interesting and applicable to restoration projects worldwide. And third, it's a unique ecosystem. It's a travertine ecosystem, which means that the water comes from deep down in the earth in the form of 7 big springs, and it's very high in calcium carbonate. And when that calcium carbonate hits the air, the CO2 degasses, and it forms travertine dams and terraces. So they're very steep waterfalls and deep pools with a beautiful aquamarine color. Havasupai Falls is another example of a travertine ecosystem. They're rare and beautiful ecosystems. I showed this map for a couple reasons. First, I want to point out that I'm not above altering a federal map with a black Sharpie. And second, I want to orient you to where Fossil Creek is. It's halfway between Flagstaff and that other city down south where you have to pay to park in the airport. And Fossil Creek is the largest tributary of the Verde River. And that's where the non-native sport fish came from. They swam up. They weren't introduced into Fossil Creek, but they swam up from the Verde River. I'd like to tell you that restoring a river is a very tranquil and peaceful process, but it's not. It's a tale of death and destruction. And the destruction comes with the removal of infrastructure. And it turns out that engineers are really pretty good at this. Engineers, once APS decided to surrender their license, it took a couple years to get their engineers on board with it, but once they turned their attention to this, they were enthusiastic and did a really good job removing the hydropower dam. They did it in a series of stages so that the sediments that had stored behind it didn't just go blowing through the river. And then they also removed over 20 miles of this flume, and you can see it traversing the entire landscape. So for almost 100 years, 90% of Fossil Creek was in that flume. Only 10% was in the river, but you can still see the ribbon of green, which is the riparian zone, because water in the arid Southwest does remarkable things. So it took APS over 5 years and $25 million but they were able to get rid of all the infrastructure, 2 hydropower dams, and put the water back in the river. But removing non-native fish, removing invasive fish, is actually an even more difficult process. And it's analogous to the chemotherapy or stem cell transplant. You have to poison a river in order to recover it. But wait, I just told you that there were native fish in Fossil Creek, and I told you that they came from the Verde. So do we want to kill those native fish in an effort to restore the river? And won't they just come back from the Verde River? And so we had to call back the engineers. And this time they were from the Bureau of Reclamation. And they built this structure, and it looks natural, but it is not. This is an artificial structure, and it's a barrier. It's very, very steep, and fish can't pass through it. So it can prevent fish from reinvading from the Verde River. Once the barrier was built, then the biologists finally got to be able to help out. And so NAU biologists, in cooperation with Fish and Wildlife Service and a number of other agencies, spent a couple weeks salvaging as many native fish as we could from Fossil Creek. And then they were put into one of these barrels. These barrels are filled with native fish. The barrels were attached to the helicopter, and the fish got the ride of their life. They were transferred to this station that was organized by Arizona Game and Fish. So it was an interagency, NGO, university collaboration. Then we poisoned the river, and it was horrible. It was really creepy and awful, and you can imagine it didn't smell very good. But after a few weeks, the river cleansed itself, and then the fish got another helicopter ride, and were lovingly reintroduced, the native fish, back into the river. So we killed the non-natives, put the natives back in, and then many of my graduate students spent the next 5 years underwater surveying the fish. But this set up a great experiment for me, because below the fish barrier, which was about 1/3 of Fossil Creek, they did not remove the invasive fish, and above the fish barrier they did. So I could look at the effect of restoring flow in the context of removing or not removing non-native fish. So did it work? And humbled to say 15 years of hard work can be boiled down to the word yes. But I'm going to share some of the details. So the first thing that happened was the travertine came back, and it came back so much faster than any of us expected. So if you go to Fossil Creek, you'll see steep travertine waterfalls, deep blue, big pools, and then backwaters. And so it very quickly created the heterogeneity that I said was so important in a healthy river. Once that happened, then the algae and the plants that photosynthesized did their work. And so they increased their primary productivity, creating more food for insects, tadpoles, and fish. And so what about the fish? How did they respond to this? This is an exaggerated diagram of what it looked like before restoration. And so the gray fish are our non-natives, and they completely dominated. And so for pretty much every 50 to 100 non-native or invasive fish, we could maybe find one native fish. So we put water back in the river and removed the non-natives, and we see a huge response of native fish. So in some parts of the river, we have 100 times more native fish than we had prior to restoration. But what happened where we didn't remove the non-native fish, below that fish barrier? Well, it's a sobering story. The native fish didn't move an inch. And so why this is important is that we can put, and APS will tell you, they put $25 million into restoring this river. And if you don't remove the non-natives, you're not going to do anything for native fish. And the native fish the non-native fish removal, although creepy and difficult, only cost $1 million. So it didn't add much to the restoration, but from the perspective of conserving or restoring fish populations, it made all the difference in the world. I'm going to share one more science story with you in terms of, we wanted to look at the mechanism of why are native fish doing so poorly when our rivers are dominated by non-native or invasive fish. And so we did an extensive diet analysis, and that sounds simple, a diet analysis before and after restoration. But the problem is, you can't exactly ask a fish what it's eating. They won't tell you. And we're not going to collect and cut open a bunch of fish after we've gone to all this problem to restore and save them. So we have to use a high-tech chemical tool using stable isotopes to get a fingerprint of their diet. But fish don't have fingers, they have fins. And so what we literally do is get a fin print. And so we capture the fish, we snip off a teeny tiny piece of their fin. It's like clipping a toenail. And then we run those through the mass spec, and then we can, from that, build the food web structure and the diet. And so what we found was that in the presence of our non-native bass and sunfish, that the non-native invasive fish were getting the really big, juicy, great aquatic insects, the big damselflies and dragonflies. And the native fish were reduced to eating table scraps, little teeny tiny midges and maybe a mayfly here and there if they were lucky. But once we removed the non-native fish, the native fish resumed their place at the top of the food chain, the kings and queens of our food chains. So I'm going to summarize in 30 seconds, 15 years of data collection, many, many graduate student papers, thousands of data points. If you increase flow, you're going to increase travertine and change the geomorphology and give great structure to the river. With more travertine, we get more deep pools, which fish love, and we also get more algae and more food for the fish. If we remove the invasive fish, then we'll see that the native fish resume the role at the top of the food chain. This is how stream ecologists high five. And so I want to conclude that the river's done its job. And now it's our job as citizens of Arizona to make sure that we don't love this river to death. And so we've got to figure out a balance between recreation in the Fossil Creek watershed and preserving this river that we've worked so hard and that APS invested so much money and their time to restore. Thank you.